Okay, so I thought in the conversations I've had with Doug, I really appreciate the fact that you want to learn more and continue your journey or start this journey of learning about the Indigenous people that occupy that have occupied this land for since the beginning of time, and I really want to help you with that. And so when we talked about Indigenous rights, Margaret was saying she was looking for a book, and I said when I was working for the school board, we said Indigenous rights is a really good starting spot for everyone. And I was looking at the book cover tonight. If you look at the book cover, it says a guide to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit issues in Canada. So it's set out that way, and it's kind of if you get into the issues and topics and movements of that book, then you're ready to branch out into discussions that are deeper and richer. And there's many books I could recommend that would be your, book 2.0 or something that if you want to continue on. So as I said in the beginning, my pronouns are he and him, and I'm non-Indigenous. I'm a white settler, and I don't wish to offend anyone tonight, but I may use terms that are sometimes don't sit well. I remember the first time I heard or saw myself referred to as a white settler in reading or at a lecture. That kind of like it hit me like a punch in the stomach, kind of saying, "Wait, I'm a white settler. I'm used to labeling everyone else, but I'm not used to being labeled." And it took a little bit to digest and come to sit with it, but I can sit with it now, and that's I'm a white settler. But I'm also grateful to live and work as an uninvited person or visitor on Turtle Island. Turtle Island is what Indigenous people refer to as North America. So we're talking about North America. I acknowledge the seen and unseen privilege of being a white settler. What's that provided for me all my life? The privileges I've had in the healthcare system, in education, and employment, and all other areas of colonized society. I humbly acknowledge I'm not an expert on being an Indigenous ally. I try really hard to be an ally, but I can't call myself an ally. None of us can call ourselves an ally. As I learned at a college, at several conferences, ally is a verb, they say. And you can't call yourself an ally, you can act as an ally. And if other people see you as an ally, they'll call you an ally, but you can't proclaim it yourself, because you can proclaim yourself an ally, and that's something in name, but you're not doing the work. So unless you're willing to do the work and do the actions, you can't call yourself an ally. I only share my personal experience and what I've learned, and it's my knowledge up till now. I'm growing, I'm learning more, I'm still reading, I'm not done this journey, and that's changing over time. So I'm sharing with you what my learning is at this time. And so I want to do tonight, because I want to kind of, when working with Doug, serve as an introduction to this book as we get into it, is kind of talk about positioning ourselves. I want to talk about the terms, like chapter 1 of Chelsea's book is about names and terms. I want to stress the importance of that, because if we become comfortable in using the proper terms, I think your discussions going forward will be much better. So I show the picture of the cow here because I grew up on a dairy farm, and if I came to you and I said, "Oh, you should be eating far more butter and having lots more ice cream, and you should have milk with every meal, and eat lots of yogurt," you'll say to me, "Well, you kind of have a vested interest in that because you're a dairy farmer, right? You're just promoting your own cause." Well, I don't come to Indigenous education and advocacy with that same background. There's nothing in this for me. I'm not doing it because I'm Indigenous. And that's what Nicole, who I worked with, who was Indigenous, liked me to state that position up front, because she said it's important for other non-Indigenous people to see that it's not just Indigenous people that are calling for equality and less discrimination. It can be people who are trying to act as advocates, co-conspirators, and act as allies. So we need to recognize that we have privilege in North America because of the Eurocentric society. We have to commit to dismantling that society that gives us the privilege. And if you have privilege, it means our society is racist. If we were in a non-racist society, no one would have privilege. If there weren't discrimination, we would not have privilege. So I'm going to explore these terms a little bit later in the meeting. And my plan is to get through what I want to say tonight, and then hopefully there's time for questions. So if there's a slide that you want to go back to, make note of it, and we can go back and continue the discussion at this meeting or another meeting. I also like to begin all presentations with a territorial acknowledgement. A territorial acknowledgement is a practice Indigenous people do when they visit someone else's territory. They acknowledge that they are a visitor to that person's land. And territorial acknowledgement is something different from a land acknowledgement, though in our society you may hear the terms interchanged. You'll see them lots nowadays. I've heard them at the beginning of commencement. Schools are now doing them at the beginning of the school day, along with the anthem. The Grey Cup did it at the beginning of the Grey Cup. I think I saw Ron McLean do one at the beginning of a TV series he was hosting. Award shows will do them. They often use the word land acknowledgement, but there's a little bit different. A land acknowledgement is quite often done by Indigenous people, and it's giving thanks for the land. It's a Haudenosaunee practice. The Haudenosaunee have something called the Thanksgiving Address, in which they give thanks for everything on and everything on, in, and on the earth and above. They'll thank all the creatures in the ground, the crawlers, the worms, all the work they do in the soil. They'll thank all the two-leggeds and four-leggeds that walk on the earth and provide food. They'll thank all the plants and trees. They'll thank all the birds and skies and stars and the sun, and they'll name each one. They could go on for hours doing a land acknowledgement and giving thanks for the land. But for them, it's about living in gratitude and recognizing that we are not the land's not here for us to possess, but we should be living in gratitude and be thankful that the land gives to us. Territorial acknowledgement is something Indigenous people do when visiting. But my friend Nicole, who's Haudenosaunee, and being this is Haudenosaunee territory, she would never give a territorial acknowledgement on her own territory. But if she went out west or went out east and visit the Micmac, she would give a territorial acknowledgement there. My territorial acknowledgement tonight, I want to acknowledge the three great nations that have occupied this land at various times. This land has been occupied by human settlers since the glaciers retreated, so about 10,000 years ago. And at that time, depends when you look into the history, depends who was living here. So there's the Chinook Nation, sometimes referred to as the Neutral Nation. There's the Anishinaabe Nation, and there's Haudenosaunee Nations. And I'll break those terms down for you later. But I want to recognize those nations and those people that looked after this land, how great they were at looking after it, their environmentalism, their care for the planet and regeneration, so that when we get to live here, we get to share this wonderful land. I also think it's important for us as non-settlers to know that we are bound by certain treaties just by living here, whether we immigrated here or were born here. There's two pictures here. The above image is called the two-row wampum. That was first signed between Dutch settlers and Haudenosaunee people, and then it was signed by English settlers and Haudenosaunee people, and it represents the idea of sharing this land. The two rows, one row represents the Indigenous people, one row represents the Europeans. You notice that they live side by side. They don't cross, they don't interfere, they don't get in any other person's politics. The idea that we would share the hunting ground, share the resources, and live side by side, and that was the agreement. And I think I keep that one in the forefront of mind. I made a copy of it. I've got it hanging up in my den. I made a woodworking copy of it to remind me that I'm here to share the land with and not interfere with other people's politics. The bottom image is of the dish with one spoon wampum. And that wampum is for anyone living in the Great Lakes area. And it was signed between Indigenous nations, primarily the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe. The idea and the principle being that the food and the resources that come out of the Great Lakes are to be shared, and you don't take more than you need. And the idea is that anyone who lives in this region also abides by this wampum. And then after settlement by the colonizers, by Europeans, we started a series of treaties. It was interesting in 1763 that King George III recognized and acknowledged that Indigenous people were the original settlers and owners of the land in North America. And he said settlers from Europe could not go on to the land without a treaty. And that started the treaty signing process. He said, you just can't a pioneer just can't walk onto the land, offer a local indigenous person $5 for an acre and say, and take over. It had been negotiated between nations. So the Haudenosaunee Nation or Anishinaabe Nation and the representative of the King of England. So I put a yellow circle there because that's about where Woodstock is on the map. And it's interesting that you're covered by about 3 different treaties that overlap. Treaty 3 at the bottom there, that's 1792. That's the Land Between Lakes Treaty. Then you're also covered by the London Township Treaty 6. And then Treaty 29, 1827 on the upper left, that's the Huron-Tract Treaty. So if you ever want to get into exploring those treaties, those are the treaties that cover the land in which you live. And it's important to know that you are on treaty land, that it's not just free land that you got, that there's treaty obligations that need to be upheld and honored. You also need to know that almost every treaty in North America that was signed between Europeans and indigenous people was broken by the Europeans and not honored. But that's something we may explore more as we get into this book. So to set us up for Indigenous rights, it's important that we learn the language and the terms, and that's what Chelsea Vowell referred to. You see here's a mishmash of names and words. Some are acceptable and some aren't. When settlers first came on, and you'll see it in the old history books, we used to call the indigenous people Indians. That term's out of favor. We don't no longer use the term Indians. It moved from Indians to maybe Aboriginals or natives. That used to be used for a while. It's no longer in favor. It's out of favor. But you know, some indigenous people who were raised being called natives, they themselves might call themselves native. That's their prerogative. They can call themselves native, but we can't. Another one would be FNMI, First Nation Métis Inuit. That's a short form. We don't shorten white people to W's. We don't shorten Canadians to C's. So it's disrespectful to shorten other indigenous names to letters too. So that's fallen out of favor. So the current term we use is indigenous, and to see how that fits, it's a catch-all. It's a kind of a umbrella term that covers the Métis, First Nation, and Inuit who occupy this territory that we call Canada, and this land. So Indigenous is your term for everyone. But as we talk about people, it's often better to be more specific. So, you know, I could say I know Aunt Margaret and Aunt Marion, and they're Canadians. But I would appear more knowledgeable if I said, oh, they're Ontarians, or I would appear more knowledgeable if I knew that they were from Woodstock. So the more specific you can be, the more respectful you are, the more you know someone. So Indigenous is a collective term for Métis, First Nations, and Inuit. But if you know a person is Inuit, then call them Inuit rather than Indigenous. If you're French, this is for Aunt Marion, there's the French version. And then if you think of that umbrella term again, okay, so the purple umbrella covers Métis, First Nation, and Inuit, but under First Nations, there are, you know, well over 100 First Nations across Canada. And then under those umbrellas, there are other nations. So we can say, well, there's the Haudenosaunee, which live on the Six Nations south of Brantford, the Anishinaabe, which live up in you know, middle Ontario, and the Mushkekowik, who live up more around the James Bay region, and they all have nations under them. And I'll just explain some of that, because I think it's important that you kind of have a concept of how these terms fit together as we get into our discussions. So under Indigenous is Haudenosaunee. We were kids, we were raised calling them Iroquois, but that was a name imposed by Europeans on people. They're allowed to select their own names. Their name is Haudenosaunee. And so under the Haudenosaunee Nation, you have the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca. Those are the 5 original founding nations of the Haudenosaunee Nation. And then the Tuscarora came and joined them later. And so on their flag, you see the representatives, the 4 squares and the great white pine tree representing those 5 nations. Under Anishinaabe, and these groups are quite often called, grouped by their language. So the other was Iroquoian languages, This is the Algonquin languages, and that covers the Ojibwe, Mississauga, Chippewa, Oji-Cree, Algonquin, Delaware, Ondawa, and Potawatomi. And so, you know, if you go up into Bruce County, you meet Chippewa nations, right? So they're just above us. The Haudenosaunee kind of occupy more of southern Ontario. Anishinaabe are more along the St. Lawrence and slightly above us in middle Ontario. Mushkekowik are more around James Bay area, so really up northern Ontario and then spreading towards the west. And there you get different dialects, the plains, the woods, Swampy Cree, the Moose, and they will use syllabics in some of their writing, separating from our use of English dialogue. The Métis are recognized as Indigenous to Canada, but their nation didn't appear until European settlers arrived. So the Métis came as descendants of unions between First Nations women and Western European men, the coureurs de bois and the fur traders. They would have children and we're often welcomed back into European culture, and we're often welcomed back into Indigenous culture. They formed their own settlements and communities, and their nation grew from that. But they are recognized as Indigenous because at least half the union was Indigenous. So, but it doesn't mean a Métis, I want to clarify, doesn't mean you're simply half and half. Like if I married an Indigenous woman now, my child would not be Métis. A Métis person has to be able to trace their lineage back to the original settlers that came from those unions hundreds of years ago. And so most of their roots are in the Red River region in Manitoba, as they were forced out. Some of them moved to Kincardine around the Great Lakes and spread across the country. They even developed their own language, which is Michif, which was a mix of the Cree, Ojibwe, and French. And then Inuit is the reference. We grew up as kids, you would hear the term Eskimo, that's no longer used. Inuit, which means the people. So you never say the Inuit because that's like saying the people, and you never say Inuit people because that's like saying people. So it's Inuit. Inuk is a single person and Inuit is many. If you hear the word Innu, that's not actually Inuit. That is a member of the First Nations who belongs to a nation in northern Quebec. So Innu is part of First Nations in northern Quebec. There's 53 communities make up Inuit, and they're in 4 regions across northern Canada. Inuktitut is their language, and there's the Nunavut flag in this image. So there's a quick rundown of what I think how Chelsea says what we call them. Now, what do we call us? And so these are terms that we need to learn to live with and accept. We are settlers, we are colonizers, we have white privilege, and we are the dominant culture. And I want to explore what some of this means. And I always tell people that when I'm going to talk about this is like, what's that cough medicine that tastes good but works? Buckley's, isn't it? Buckley's cough syrup. It tastes terrible, but it works. And so sometimes learning this and hearing these ideas, it doesn't sit well and it makes you feel bad, but it's good work because it helps you on your learning journey. So I'm going to quote from Chelsea Vowell here. This is page 14. She said, well, some people do argue that the people living today have no connection to those first Europeans in the 15th and 16th centuries. We cannot escape our history so easily. The social, political systems that currently exist in Canada are a direct result of the European-based cultures that first arrived in the Americas all those centuries ago. So you can say, I'm not racist now. I didn't do this. I didn't create residential schools. I didn't conquer the land. That's true, but you are living in the benefits of all that. So it is on you to recognize that and honor that and say, what am I going to do to correct it and fix things? This quote, I love it, says, a friendly reminder that white privilege doesn't mean your life isn't hard. You can have a hard life as a white person. It just means that your life is never hard because of the color of your skin. There may be other factors that make your life hard, but the color of your skin will never be one of the reasons your life is hard. Okay? And that's a good thing to keep in mind, because some people will say, oh, well, I don't have white privilege because my life was hard. No, your life is never hard because of your color of your skin. And so here I have some quotes from Chelsea. In her book, she said, Canada has a set of relatively new cultural norms that are settler-based, and these cultural norms constitute the mainstream. So how we operate mainstream Canada, what we watch on TV, how we behave, how we run our restaurants or roads, how we view society, or even our whole economy. Let's buy so we can keep the economy going. That's all mainstream North American dominant culture, right? So she says in Canada, there are strong ideas about how to act. We're expected to act according to these beliefs, but they don't always mirror Indigenous expectations. So I said, we Canadians think it's acceptable to commodify cultural expressions, right? That's part of our mainstream thinking. If I see something I can make money off it, I can do it. For example, if I can make money selling tents that look like teepees, then my mainstream cultural thinking is, yeah, let's do it. If I can make the tent, I can sell it. But push back. Who gives you the right to make something that belongs to another culture? What makes you think that you have that right to just take something from someone else's culture, make money off it, make dream catchers and sell them? That's maybe a Western dominant view of society and economy, but that's not everyone else's. And who says our dominant culture is the right way? Chelsea says, cultural expressions cannot be so easily commodified and can be seen as threatening, transgressive, or simply not Canadian when they resist that. In our narrow mainstream dominant cultural thinking, as non-Indigenous people, we become angry when we're told we can't wear a feather headdress for Halloween, or we can't dress as Halloween maiden, or we can't paint in the woodland style if we want to be an artist. Those belong to other cultures, and people get upset when they're told at a fashion show that you can't dress your models in head feathers. Well, you can't. Head feathers are earned, and for us to grab a headdress and wear it around is like someone grabbing an Olympic gold medal and wearing it around saying, I won a gold medal, without earning the gold medal, or wearing a Victorian cross without earning a Victorian cross. There's certain things in society that have to be earned before you have the right to wear them, and that would be a feather headdress that so many fashion designers think they can have. So the real issue here is, what right do we have to be angry? Or in other words, why do we think our dominant cultural thinking, commodifying everything, is okay? Is that the only view of the culture or world? And so on my learning journey, I'm really starting to explore Indigenous ways of knowing and how that pushes back against my ways of knowing. And as I left the school board, because I retired on June 30th, we were really starting to, challenge the system, saying, you always teach this material this way. So you're using non-Indigenous ways of teaching, like sit in rows, be quiet. Well, why not incorporate Indigenous ways of teaching, which is sit in a circle and share? Why not incorporate Indigenous ways of naming plants? Why do plants have to be named after Latin names or English names? Why can't you recognize them, since we're on Indigenous land, the Indigenous name for that plant and the Indigenous view of the world? So this is a little bit of discussion about privilege, what privilege is. It's hard to sit down and decide that, yes, it's like you're in a 50-meter mark, you're at the 50-meter mark in a 100-meter dash. You've got that kind of lead because you were born white. You have advantages that are systematically, culturally, psychologically there. And they've been built up and cemented for hundreds of years. And many people can't look at it because it's too difficult. It's hard to believe, like you're saying, no, I don't think I have this advantage. Yeah, you do if you're white. Meaning, it's not something that they want to face on a daily basis, and they don't want it held up and put in their face. But unless we have to give up our privilege. We have to create a society where privilege doesn't exist. And this is why. Living with stress can be psychologically draining. When you have privilege and fail to recognize it, you aren't recognizing the psychological stress that others are living with when they don't have privilege. I'm not sure if I included the slide. I didn't. I saw a picture once, a slide. It was, if they asked men and women separately, what kind of things do you worry about when you go out on the street? And the men's list had nothing on it. And the women's list had things like, I worry about where I'm going to park. I worry about the lighting. I worry about the distance from my car to the door. I worry that my car doors are locked. I worry that my purse is secure. And their list went on and on and on. And so that's male privilege versus from the point of view of a woman. And it really bothers me that just because I'm male, I don't have this psychological stress of worrying about things like that. So I have a male privilege that I don't have that psychological stress that women have. I also have heterosexual privilege. My wife and I can give my wife a hug and hold her hands anywhere I want. A restaurant, walking down the street, in the parking lot, I can give her a hug. Lesbians and gays, men, they can't. They have to think twice about when they're going to show affection. That's not fair. That's not right in a society. They shouldn't have to live with that psychological stress of worrying when they're going to show affection. And the same is for white. For being white, I don't very often worry about where I go in Canada and how I live and where I shop. People of color, blacks, Indigenous people, they go into a store and they're monitored by the security agents. They go into it for support and treatment, and people are othering them. And so it's Chelsea Bowell, and this journey you're on about learning about Indigenous rights is going to be also exploring privilege and what you have when you have privilege. And when you're used to having privilege, people that ask for equity, that seems like oppression to you, to us, to me, right? We have to learn that they're not asking to oppress us, they're simply asking for equity. And so the thing I've done, and I'm trying to do, and why I'm so want to join this group in this discussion, is acknowledge my privilege and commit to disrupting the system. I want to disrupt the systematic racism, the systemic racism against Indigenous people and people of color and the LGBT community. White people, those people in society with white privilege, need to acknowledge that society with privilege is a flawed society, and then do the heavy work of dismantling such societies. White privilege has to be dismantled by whites. Systemic racism has to be ended by whites. White people, no one's asking you to apologize for your ancestors. We're asking you to pull down and dismantle the system they built. The statues is a good start. The terms, the street names. Get rid of the signs of anything that is racism and start rebuilding. This is my last slide, and we can move into discussion if you wish, Doug. Some of us have unearned privilege. Male privilege, I'm speaking for myself. White privilege, heterosexual privilege. I have privilege and I recognize it. That's step one, recognition. When you have privilege, you have to recognize it and admit it. Step two is doing something about it. You should be compelled to end privilege. You should be compelled to disrupt the systems that gave you privilege, because as long as privilege exists, we don't live in an equitable and equal society. And yet we as Canadians, we stress so much that's who we are. Canada is about equity. Canada is about equality. Canada is about freedom. Canada is about democracy. But when it's filled with systemic discrimination, is it really? And I find that hard to live with. That's why my commitment to disrupt it. There are currently systemic structures that give people privilege, and as long as those exist, our society is discriminatory. I want to disrupt, so I come to you. I come to learn the truths that I need to learn so I can carry out my mission. Conversations that we will have as we explore Chelsea Bowell's book will educate me. I want to help you because maybe I'm a bit further along in my journey. The experiences I've had in Edmonton, Montreal, Toronto, conferences, working with Nicole, I can maybe assist you, but you're going to push me in my thinking too. I need teaching in order to wake me up so I'm entrenched. Because I'm so entrenched in privilege, I have trouble seeing it. I need the truths in order to disrupt the system. I want to challenge the institutions and the people who seek to hold on to privilege. These privilege deniers have old and rehearsed arguments that I want to challenge. I'm looking for learning that would help me take them on.